Gulliver travels to Lilliput. Once upon a time, there was a man named Gulliver. He was a curious person, and he loved to visit new places and meet new people. One day, Gulliver packed his bags, said goodbye to his wife, and boarded a ship that was sailing to the South Sea. After sailing for many days, one of the sailors spotted a large rock up ahead. The captain tried to steer around it, but it was no use. The wind pushed the ship right into it. The ship ran into the rock and split in half. Gulliver and the crew were shipwrecked. The sailors had to abandon the ship. They set out in a rowboat, hoping to find land. Suddenly, a storm started, and strong waves smashed into the rowboat. The little boat rocked from side to side and soon capsized. Gulliver and the other sailors were tossed into the sea. Before long, Gulliver was separated from the others. He swam through the stormy sea as waves crashed around him and thunder boomed overhead. Just when he was too tired to swim any further, Gulliver spotted a nearby island. He used the last of his energy to swim to shore and then collapsed on the grass and fell into a deep sleep. When Gulliver woke the next morning, he tried to sit up, but something was holding him down. His arms and legs were tied to the ground, and so was his hair. Gulliver could even feel tiny threads crisscrossing his chest. He was trapped. Poor Gulliver couldn't even turn his head. Gulliver lay on his back, wondering what to do next. Before long, he felt something tickle his legs. Then it moved up his chest, almost to his chin. Gulliver looked down and was surprised to see a tiny person standing on his chest. The little man was only as big as one of Gulliver's fingers, which is to say that he wasn't very big at all. He held a tiny bow and arrow in his hands and looked at Gulliver curiously. Just then, Gulliver felt a bunch of other tiny people running up his legs. When they reached his chest, they stared at Gulliver and whispered excitedly in a strange language. Not sure what to do, Gulliver yelled. The tiny people were terribly frightened by the sound of his booming voice. They leaped off of him in a hurry. Gulliver tried to see if anyone had been hurt by jumping from such a great height, but he was unable to turn his head. Gulliver wiggled on the ground as he tried to sit up. He quickly realized that he was only tied down by string. By pulling hard, he managed to break some of the strings that held down his hair and his left arm. Now able to move his head a few inches, Gulliver tried to see what was happening beside him. Tolgo Phonak! Cried a tiny man as Gulliver moved. Suddenly, Gulliver felt 100 tiny arrows prick his left hand. The little people had attacked him, but the arrows were so small that they didn't hurt Gulliver. They only felt like little pinpricks. Gulliver decided that the best thing to do was to just lie still. He didn't want to further upset the little people, and he certainly did not want to squish them by moving. But were they really little people? Maybe they were normal sized, and Gulliver was gigantic. He wasn't so sure anymore. Before long, Gulliver heard a commotion beside him. After some time, the tiny people cut the remaining strings fastened to Gulliver's hair. He turned his head and saw that a platform had been built beside him. Standing on the platform was a tiny man dressed in fine clothes. This finely dressed man, who Gulliver soon learned was a great lord, spoke for a long time. Of course, Gulliver didn't understand a word of it, but everyone else seemed quite impressed by the speech. When the lord finished speaking, Gulliver carefully raised his left arm and pointed to his mouth, trying to show that he was hungry. The lord understood and instructed the people to feed Gulliver. A group of tiny people climbed onto Gulliver, carrying baskets full of food. Gulliver opened his mouth, and they threw food into it as fast as they could. The food was so small that Gulliver ate 3 loaves of bread in one mouthful. Before long, Gulliver had eaten everything. The tiny people were amazed at how much he ate. A short time later, Gulliver was loaded onto a long wheeled platform. Once he was fastened to it, hundreds of tiny horses began pulling him down the road. They were bringing Gulliver to meet the Emperor. When they finally arrived in the capital, Gulliver was brought to the largest building in the city. He was removed from the wheeled platform, and a chain was placed around his ankles to keep him from running away. Gulliver had many visitors. The emperor, his counselors, and the townspeople were curious about the giant man. Gulliver sat politely as they chattered in their strange language. The next day, a group of tiny tutors came to teach Gulliver their language. Gulliver was very clever, so he was quickly able to understand and speak the new words. He learned that the kingdom was called Lilliput and the tiny people were Lilliputians. Meanwhile, the emperor and his counselors were trying to find out what to do with Gulliver. Although he was large enough to squish them, he hadn't done anything to frighten the Lilliputians. In fact, Gulliver was quite nice. But could he live with them? Some of the counselors were worried that he would eat all of the food in the kingdom. Finally, the emperor came to see Gulliver. Please, Gulliver said, will you release me? We will remove your chains, said the emperor, but you must make a few promises first. The next day, there was a grand ceremony. Gulliver was asked to promise not to leave Lilliput without the emperor's permission. He also had to be careful not to frighten or squish any of the Lilliputians as he walked around the kingdom. Gulliver vowed to help deliver messages, construct buildings, and keep Lilliput safe. Gulliver put his hand over his heart as gentlemen do and promised to follow the rules. Then he repeated the promise according to the Lilliputian way. He held his right foot in his left hand and placed the middle finger of his right hand on the top of his head, stretching his thumb to the tip of his ear. The emperor and the Lilliputians cheered wildly. Gulliver's chains were removed. He was free. Gulliver lived in Lilliput for some time, helping the emperor and the Lilliputians. One day, a large rowboat washed ashore, large enough for Gulliver, that is. He repaired the boat, said goodbye to the emperor, and set sail for England. It was time for a new adventure.